Welcome to the Irish NFL show. So many talking points from the Week 18 action. We are bound for the playoffs. But first, we're going to react to the final weekend of regular season action now. We'll get to all the talking points. Our weekly talking points show is, as always, brought to you by our partner, QuinnBet. Well, 14 playoff teams remain. Obviously, the Bills are surging. The Eagles are sliding. The Texans seem to be the Cinderella team. The Dolphins and the Chiefs remain unconvincing, but they still both punched their tickets over the weekend. The Falcons sacked their head coach. The Jaguars blew up, and in the process, of course, they managed to wave the Steelers into the postseason. While we look at all the surprises, the sure things, and the potential dark horses heading into the playoffs, we'll also, of course, survey the wreckage for the teams left to wonder where it all went wrong. And hint, hint, the three of us here tonight will be surveying plenty of wreckage regarding our own teams, Bears, Giants, and Patriots, respectively. Well, talking points, let's kick off, Shane, with Black Monday, because the news today, not unexpected. We've seen Ron Rivera get the exit door, and Arthur Smith, of course, Falcons coach, sacked. One of the points on Arthur Smith, though, I wanted to start off with, very angry, obviously, after the final whistle at the weekend in that Saints game. And I have to be honest, at first blush, when I was watching it, and I only kind of caught it on Red Zone, I'm thinking, you need to contain it there. You shouldn't be reacting like that. So what? They punched the touchdown in for Jamal Williams on the final play instead of taking a knee and padded out the score. But actually, when you watch it back, the Saints were in victory formation. Dennis Allen even admitted he sent them in victory formation. And Jameis Winston decides in his infinite wisdom, and look, if Jameis Winston made good decisions when he had his hands on the football, then Jameis Winston wouldn't be a backup quarterback, let's be honest. He'll hand the ball off to Jamal Williams, because Jamal Williams hadn't had a touchdown all season after being the leading scorer last year when he was with, where was he last in the Lions, wasn't he? 17 touchdowns last season. Williams punches it in while the Falcons are expecting the Saints to take a knee. So actually, I think in the circumstances, Smith is justifiably angry. He takes it out on Dennis Allen, who says, "Oh, they did that on their own," which is also kind of weak. And maybe we'll get to Dennis Allen in a little bit, though he expects to be around for next season. But let's start with Arthur Smith. It's not a surprise, but for a guy who was kind of at one point considered the next big offensive mind, really it ended with a whimper.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it ended with a whimper in particular is how bad the Falcons have been on offense all season. We saw it in even as far back as Wembley throughout the season. You never really had the anticipation that the Falcons were really going to light up, and they're not short on talent. They really aren't. There's a bit of a quarterback question mark over there, but they're not short on the guys to come out and play particularly well. I'm talking about the incident yesterday as well. I think the anger shown by him there is, I think, it's more him trying to show some fight. He obviously knew or had a feeling that the writing was on the wall, trying to show that he's still passionate, maybe trying to put himself out for another job in future. But you can't look back at his tenure in the Falcons and think, yeah, that was a good job. He made the most out of the roster there, because he quite simply didn't. And we saw that, Desmond Ridder being put in again as quarterback, somebody who shows flashes of what he's able to do. I remember in the early part of the season, the Falcons were particularly good at home and not very good away. So we saw the potential of what Desmond Ridder can do. I'm not quite sure what is actually up with the planning and how the Falcons are managing to prepare for each game, because there is no consistency there when it comes to the quarterback play. And then it comes to how well they use Bijan Robinson. I mean, 11 carries for 28 yards. I know he made 7 receptions for over 100 yards and got a touchdown for the Falcons yesterday. But in terms of being able to get the run game going, and I was talking about it with a couple of other guys as well, the ability to have a balanced offense and not rely on one player is key. So the run game, as much as we were talking about we talk often about the evaluation of the running back position, being able to use a talent like Bijan Robinson is key. And he just didn't get the most out of them. So, look, I could see why he was annoyed about the victory formation. I see a lot of people talking about the point that when someone's in victory formation, it's a sort of informal contract between teams that, game is over, battle is done. Let's put things down because we don't want to get ourselves injured here by playing for no exact reason. And I could see why the anger came out there. It's understandable, because originally when you see that, you're like, here he's lashing out because he's quite annoyed at how bad things have gone. And getting beaten that hard on your home turf by a divisional rival is never a good look. But I think that, plain and simple, the job he did on offense in particular just wasn't good enough. And the Falcons are in a division which they could have won. The NFC South is there for the taking for anybody who can put together a good string of plays. The Buccaneers has proved, and the Falcons, despite having the talent, didn't get the results.
From that perspective, Brian, as Shane has outlined, it's not necessarily an unattractive prospect for anyone going in. I mean, yes, there's obviously a big question over who your quarterback's going to be, and Arthur Smith couldn't resolve that himself, ultimately to his cost. But they're not lacking in talent on either side of the ball. You know, their defense was a top 10 defense for most of the season, and certainly showed up big on more than one occasion. You know, when you've got a team with the like of Bijan, who showed out in his first season, in his rookie season, you got players like Kyle Pitts, like Drake London. They can play, and we talked about before the season as potentially being one of the more exciting teams. It didn't really turn out that way, and Arthur Smith kind of didn't seem to know himself even how to get the best out of them at times, and that's what's cost him his job. But the South is a straightforward enough division to get through. You can get to the playoffs with 9 wins.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised that Terry Fontenot, the GM, isn't in the picture here for potential firing as well. I know it's a fast moving day, so maybe something may materialize over the course of the next few hours or into tomorrow. But 3 seasons as GM, 7-10, 7-10, 7-10, 3 losing seasons. And yeah, you touched on all the skill players he's brought in, but he has missed on some other picks in the later rounds, which it's all well and good bringing your Bijan Robinson, your Drake Londons, and your Kyle Pitts, all these marquee players in the first round, but you got to bring a bit of a stability to the situation. So I read one piece today saying they shouldn't have drafted Bijan Robinson. They had enough players there. They had the skill set of Cordell Patterson, Algier in the run game. They had enough there, and they should have focused more so on a quarterback or other players, or even Jalen Carter, who obviously they would have known very well from being in that kind of neck of the woods, and obviously he dropped down the board and would have been there for them to select. That being said, you said at the start of the season, Colin, this was a division. They had enough players there. They had enough skill set across the board to go and win this division. You know, we touched on Ryan Nelson coming in as defensive coordinator. Everything seems to be going in their direction. But ultimately, the quarterback play, I mean, not the interception. It was the misplay when they're in the red zone to put them, I think it would have brought it back to 28-21, and they went for it and they missed it. And Arthur Smith's facial expression, and we've seen that time and time again over the season, clear frustration at the quarterback's inability to get the job done. And I think Colin rightly called out, a number of times the Falcons, removed themselves from the sweepstakes, at a very early stage in Lamar Jackson, and he goes and has an MVP season. They're still waiting for the quarterback. They're selecting the latter stage of the top 10. So will they get the quarterback this offseason? Maybe Justin Fields is in play, but back to your point, it feels like a lost season. It feels like it was there for them just to get, yet again, the Falcons find ways to lose certain games, which ultimately leads to them not winning the division.
Shane, the vacancy as well, and I was going to say Washington, but technically it's in Maryland, of course, because the Washington Commanders are moving on from Ron Rivera. No surprise there. New owner wants to put a stamp on it, and they've made quite a few moves and some interesting cross-code moves there in terms of how they're going to fill out the front office.
Yeah, I think the first thing I don't think it's particularly surprising that Ron Rivera was moved on. I think, like you said, there's a new ownership group coming in. They're going to have a new quarterback after getting the second overall pick, or at least it's highly expected to have a new quarterback. They're building towards a new stadium. It's all new in Washington. They're even still adjusting to their new name. So I don't really think that that's a surprising move, and I think it's probably smart that they got it done early so they can try and look for a replacement. I think the 2 big names that will always be linked to a move like this will be Bill Belichick and Jim Harbaugh. So it's not really a surprising move. You mentioned there about the cross-code move, who's the name of the man has just escaped me, but the former Golden State Warriors as a general manager or something like that has moved in. I will see if I can get the.
Well, it's a combination. Sorry, Connor. So it's a combination of a few today. He's brought in
Bob Myers,
Spielman, Mayhew. There's a number that they're building a big committee to make sure that they select the next head coach. Is the right man. Sorry, Shane. Go on.
Yeah, well, what I'm wondering now is of course, like, I can't remember the last time a good decision's ever been made by a committee, and I understand obviously with the ability to win and with all the great success that the Golden State Warriors have had in recent years, not only in terms of what they've done on the court, I can't say on the field, but in being able to build a new stadium, build their brand, build a larger fan base internationally, which of course the Commanders are struggling to do with the name change, the fact they're playing in not a great stadium. I can understand why they went to I believe it was the 2-time NBA Executive of the Year, Bob Myers, to help run the franchise. I can understand why that is a move they can go for, but it's also worth remembering that trying to negotiate the cost cap, trying to negotiate drafts is a very different prospect in the NFL than it is in the NBA. The NBA is a bit more like baseball, and that money can buy success. And fair enough, the Commanders have more money now than they did beforehand. It's one of the things that makes coaching the Commanders a more exciting prospect, something that people are maybe more likely to want to do than before. Than, let's say, if Ron Rivera got fired a year ago, 2 years ago. But it is the kind of thing. Fair enough, they bring a lot of people. I just hope for the Commanders that there isn't the kind of butting of heads or a butting of egos within that organization that will end up leading to some form of dysfunction, because dysfunctional franchises do dysfunctional things. There's a great chance here for the Commanders to reset and build towards a brighter future. But, too many chefs can spoil the broth.
One person that we haven't seen on the move, Brian, and their press conference turned out to be a bit of a damn squib in New England this morning. Bill Belichick, although he's hinting that he might be prepared to accept a revised role and maybe not be the all-powerful one in Foxborough anymore. At least that's how his comments were interpreted when he said he's happy to do whatever it takes to help the team.
Yeah, we obviously were having our conversation at lunchtime before the press conference started, and we were
all excited, giddy we were.
Highly anticipating some news, but of course it's a Belichick press conference. We should have known better. I think the two key pieces that came out of it, one, he clearly called out in fairness, and he's never been this upfront. He goes, "I've got a contract here," so I think he's marking his cards very much with Kraft, that if you want me gone, one, you're either going to have to pay me, or two, you're going to have to potentially find an alternative team to take me on. Obviously, the Falcons have been linked this evening as well. And then obviously the piece which he touched on is that he touched on, if there was changes to be made, I'm open to working with some new people come in. I assume by that he means that if a new general manager was to come back in, a new GM was to come in and take over the situation, that he would, as you said, release the reins and get used to that kind of new surroundings, because it's been quite some time. It's interesting to see how this is going to play out, because he did say towards the latter end of the interview he's due to meet the owners, I think Wednesday, or certainly over the course of the next 2 days.
I think the sit down with Jonathan and Robert Kraft is supposed to be happening around now. Based on the reports I see, it's a Monday evening. But like that, I mean, I'm not quite sure if we can expect anything concrete out of any of those meetings for a little while.
Well, look, it's a game of chess here at the moment, isn't it? Like, it's going to be, he's not going to budge, and I think Kraft is probably hoping he budges, but ultimately it's going to come down to what they want to do. Who's going to make the first move? Is it going to be a case of trying to find the team that wants to take him on and obviously agree some kind of trade partnership, or do they ultimately have to fire him and essentially pay him off? It's interesting to see, because
there'll be plenty of time, of course, to talk about who moves in to take these coaching jobs, and we have the more exciting business of the playoffs to get to before we get to all that. But one thing that's intriguing, Shane, that you mentioned is, there's this whole swirling rumor mill about whether Jim Harbaugh comes back to the NFL, which now has metastasized into the twofer. So do you take Jim Harbaugh as coach and then maybe get JJ McCarthy and do the twofer where you get the quarterback as well? JJ McCarthy obviously riding high given the way Michigan have performed in college football this year, which is kind of intriguing. I mean, it sounds almost too good to be true and probably won't happen, but there might be owners who would like the idea of sorting the two, bringing in a head coach who's intimately familiar with your quarterback of the future, who, if you have the right draft capital, and you would imagine probably the Commanders would be in the perfect position to do it, because you can't imagine JJ McCarthy's going to go in the top 2 or 3. He'll go behind Williams, Drake May, and possibly Bo Nix or Michael Penix.
Yeah, I think the word of warning I'll put onto that is, like you mentioned, too good to be true. Whenever you try to recreate something, it's very difficult to actually get positive results. I think if Harbaugh does go to wherever it is he ends up, there needs to be some kind of setting renew. And I think he's maybe better off, in as much as there are other coaches that are better off going to a team that has a well-established quarterback, a la the Chargers, who are looking for somebody. I think Harbaugh is the man to come into somewhere that is getting a fresh quarterback, but I'm not quite sure whether going for another Michigan man, as much as you're trying to carry on that connection from what has been a very successful college season. We have the national championship being played tonight. when you're trying to recreate these things in the NFL, as soon as things go wrong, you then start looking back and then trying to redo things you did. And psychologically, that never works. The second you start looking back, you forget to look forward. And I think that if Harbaugh is going to come into the NFL, which I think is increasingly likely considering how, I guess, Michigan fans have portrayed the way he's been treated throughout the season, and just the fact that it's that he has a good record, and he I think a lot of NFL teams could do with a coach like him, who is a solid offensive mind, who has spent his time in college, finishing his project with Michigan, getting them back to being one of the best in the country. And now he can come on and take on another project. He's not the kind of person who is an instant, impact manager. You want to give it a couple of seasons before you can really start getting the results of bringing Harbaugh in. So for a team like the Commanders, who are probably a project, it's something that I think works well. And also, who knows, he could bunk in with his brother who lives down the road in Baltimore. I'm sure they could share a house at some point. So in terms of what Harbaugh can bring, his pedigree doesn't need much explaining. He's a man who commands respect, which is something which is very important when he goes at the NFL. But as to whether he should bring over or not even the Michigan quarterback, almost any of the Michigan players that he's with, I'm not quite so sure, because it just, you don't want to get in the door and already there's a feeling of favoritism because you've already worked with somebody who's at your college. You might as well start afresh and be looking forward towards Super Bowl and not looking back at the College National Championship.
Yeah, if it's a multi-year project you're after, that's David Tepper, owner of the Carolina Panthers, out anyway. You get about 6 games to impress at Carolina before you get a taxi out of there. Brian, you wanted to make a point on Jim Harbaugh before we move on to the playoffs.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation this evening around the Raiders, and they're saying it's now down to Harbaugh or Antonio Pierce to which one of them will be offered the role. I'd be surprised if they don't go Antonio Pierce. I think the Raiders will have learned their lesson of getting rid of interim head coaches that turn seasons around and get them to the playoffs only to lose out and then decide to go a different route. I think Harbaugh might be destined for LA and the Chargers. That seems to be the obvious kind of one that's been out there for some time. You're talking about a head coach coming in with the reputation to solidify a team and, put a stamp on it. If ever a team needs a kind of a rebound of a coach like Brandon Staley, it's the Chargers. I think it's a model fit to go and work with Justin Herbert, but maybe he'll buy into the operation or the model in which Washington are trying to build, or even the Raiders with the owners there, that what they're looking to do. And sometimes you got to look at the situation in the division. Realistically, which is the most competitive division for him, or how quickly can he turn around the team in a division? I'm not sure either divisions, whether it's the NFC East or the AFC West, are probably the right ones, but he's got the pick. He's gonna have a pick of options come next week.
All right, let's park the front office and locker room clear out for there and look at happier times and happier teams. Shane, if we kind of move through the rapid fire round, I was going to just run through a couple of questions before we get into the playoffs in more detail. Which team do you think is happiest to be in the playoffs?
That's a difficult question. I think it's a difference between happiest and most fortunate. I think the most fortunate are the leaders.
Oh, we'll get there, yeah.
Because I don't think, that's talk about a team which, everyone who's looking at them is like, you know what, I don't think you should be there. And they did. There's a happiest, there's a couple of the Rams have developed quite well through the second half of the season. The Bills similarly have gone on a fantastic run and clinched the number 2 seed. But I think the one that's probably the happiest is the Green Bay Packers. I mean, here's a franchise that has had elite quarterback play for so long. This is their first season after Aaron Rodgers has left. A lot of question marks hanging around the team before it started. An assumption, I think, before the season started that it was between the Lions and the Vikings to win the NFC North. I know the Vikings ended up dealing with more problems than we anticipated. The Lions did end up sealing the division. And the Packers have managed to hit a nice couple of purple patches and beaten a couple of decent opponents along the way to seal a playoff spot. Sure enough, it was, they were only got in there by the skin of their teeth. If they had one game less, it would have been the Seahawks in there. But I think it's important to talk about where we're focusing on Jordan Love in particular. It's okay for someone not to be a hit straight away. If you're a Green Bay Packers fan and there's a lot of talk around the Packers obviously one of those teams that sort of gets a lot of the media speculation and talk about quarterbacks. It's okay. People are trying to figure out now whether Jordan Love is the kind of guy who can lead the team for 10 years or whether he's a bit of a flash in the pan. It's okay to let someone be not an immediate hit, not not elite straight away, and let him develop over a couple of years. And I think throughout this year, we've seen Jordan Love go from, great game to bad game to managing to get some sort of consistency near the end of the year. That's quite important quarterback growth that instills confidence that the Green Bay Packers can be an even better team next year. Do I think they'll beat the Dallas Cowboys this week? No. But in terms of the expectations before the season, well, like this is the youngest team in the NFL. This is a very young squad. It's quite clear that they're building for the future. The fact that they are getting playoff experience now, and they're getting wins under their belt already. Before all those players start maturing in the next couple of years, I think the Green Bay have every right to be happy.
Obviously, I'm not bitter at all, Shane, and knowing a lot of Packers fans, there's no way they're happy to be in the playoffs. It's their birthright. That's what they're entitled to. And we wish Jordan Love well. The Packers, as we know, managed to convert about one Super Bowl per Hall of Fame quarterback per each 10 years. So that journey begins, I guess, in the playoffs. Of course, I'm bitter. I leave it there for the Packers.
Well, 10 in a row. I'm sorry to bring it up. Was it 10 in a row now that the Packers have over the Bears? I think that I'm hoping that'll change soon enough now with the good draft capital. But that was a tough game yesterday.
Yeah, 10 in a row. 6 of those Fields has lost himself. We won't go there. Brian, which team has the most to prove in the playoffs?
Oh, that's a good one. I thought you were going to ask me who I think would be genuinely happy to be in. Who's got the most to prove? That's a tough one. I'll give you an answer, and I think people probably think it's a strange answer. I think it's the Chiefs, and it's probably a little bit surprising, bearing in mind they are the Super Bowl champions right now, but they haven't played very well this season. And should they go and beat Miami this weekend, they'll likely potentially go into Buffalo, who could, assuming Buffalo take care of business against the Steelers. And they're the 2 seed. Yeah, so they go into Buffalo. So then we're going to have a rematch, and we've been having these ding-dong battles between the Bills and the Chiefs over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, and the Bills seem to come out of the right side of most of them, but yet they don't seem to win the ones in the playoffs. So it'll be interesting storyline. But bearing in mind how agitated we've seen the team over the course of the last month, in particular on the sideline during the games, the offense, they don't seem to be all in unison with one another. Obviously, nobody played really yesterday. They got over the line last week against the Bengals. They struggled, I think, in a roundabout way. And it probably sounds bizarre. I think they've got the biggest point to prove, because all the other teams that come into the playoffs have had a good season overall. Dolphins have fallen away, but for a large part of the season, they were really strong, and they were in the number 2 seat up to the very end. I think the Chiefs right now are sitting there probably thinking, we've got to go out and make a point to a lot of teams that we're still hanging around and we still want to retain our title.
I don't think that's bizarre at all. If you had put me on the spot, I would have said either the Chiefs, to your point, or potentially the Eagles, given the thought process last year was, they'll run it back and they'll go one better, and given the strength and depth they appeared to have on their roster and all of that. It's interesting to hear Peter King actually on Sky Sports saying this is a team that aged overnight. They've made the oldest mistake in sports. They kept a lot of their veteran players 1 year too long, and they're 1 year past their peak now, which, look, we'll see going into the playoffs. They could be a dangerous one. Shane, to wrap it up then, who's your dark horse?
The Los Angeles Rams are my dark horse, and I think that's mainly because the way that they've developed over the year, and just how good of a coach Sean McVay is. I think I definitely forgot that coming into the season. I think, remember, we saw the Rams win a Super Bowl, and we thought, okay, that was them mortgaging their future. They're going to be gone for a couple of years before they start coming back in. And we see now that it's a young team. They've hit a couple of home runs in the draft, particularly with Puka Nacua. Matthew Stafford is playing well. He's going into a place he knows in Detroit. They can build momentum going into this. There's not a single team that they are afraid of, not even the 49ers. And I know, fair enough, the win against the 49ers yesterday has a massive asterisk with the fact that the Niners were benching a lot of their starters. But the Rams are going to be very dangerous. On the AFC side of things, as much as there's a lot of teams like the Browns and Texans who will be tricky, I don't see any of those going as far as winning the Super Bowl. But if the Rams got it where the NFC champions and managed to get as far as Las Vegas, they have a decent chance simply because there's experience there. They have a very good head coach, and I think they're a team that have matured just at the right time.
I think that's a good shout. Brian, I don't know whether they're a dark horse since they won the division, but they kind of crept up on the rail, the Buffalo Bills. I wanted to talk about Sunday night's game. if you told me this was an opening game of the season rather than a Week 18 game, I would have believed you. It was very sloppy for both teams, which perhaps reflected the magnitude of what was at stake. The division, the number 2 seed in the AFC, potentially 2 home games in the playoffs, provided you win your first one, and we'll see how Buffalo go against the Steelers. But suddenly the Bills went from being, you know, a massive disappointment to everything clicking just at the right time. Do you think, and we questioned it at the time, whether it was the right decision or whether he was being made a scapegoat, but maybe in hindsight now we need to eat a bit of humble pie here. Was the firing of Ken Dorsey, the offensive coordinator, actually the thing that helped it all go right?
Well, they're 6-1 since he left, and the numbers tell a tale of maybe not so much the play calling, more about the cohesion and how players wanted to play. Like, there's a completely different mindset there. I wouldn't say it's been great. I wouldn't say it's been like, it's not like it's completely revamped and they've been absolutely fantastic. I think they've had their struggles. We touched on it last Thursday. You know, they struggled last weekend against the Patriots, in terms, and the week prior to that in SoFi against the Chargers, and even last night. Like, Josh Allen for me was a bit. He wasn't. I thought he should be a little bit more cautious at times. The interception in the red zone, trying to throw the ball away, the interception where he just threw it up, I felt, and then he has the fumble in the red zone at a critical point in the game. But I thought they were sloppy again last night, and I thought if it wasn't for the 90-yard punt return, that got them back into the game. And it looked like the
they
game was
also, call back to the 12 man on the field. That was the last straw that got, in inverted commas, Ken Dorsey fired. Like the play before halftime where they ran out of time was daft. That's really, really bad clock management, really bad play calling, and could have ultimately cost them. Like, if the Dolphins hadn't coughed up that massive punt return after halftime, Bills could have really regretted not having the opportunity to kick that field goal, which would have been a chip shot.
But this is the thing with the likes of Josh Allen. There's a narrative out there on Josh Allen. There's a narrative for different quarterbacks, because certain teams do that and they get criticised in Thursday of the week between their local media and the NFL and the general sense around the league. Where with Josh Allen, he's like, oh, he's a gunslinger. That's the way he plays. He plays with his, his heart on his shoulder. He's always going to go for it. But there has to be a time where a head coach needs to step in and say, no, the most sensible thing here in this game is to take that field goal. And just touched on the Dolphins. The second half, they went 3-0, 3-0, 3-0, 4-0, 4-0. They had the ball at the end. They couldn't get it done. They didn't score in the first quarter, third quarter, and the fourth quarter. And yet the Bills eventually got over the line. Like, it wasn't the most comprehensive or, impressive. They've fallen into the two seed. They've gone on a great run. Don't get me wrong. We've seen teams come into the playoffs at the right time, go on their own. But ultimately, they're going to have to beat the Chiefs or beat the Ravens to get to the Super Bowl. And that, to me, is too big of an ask right now. They're not playing on a level, I think, once they've gone on a run. They're not playing a level for me to be in the Super Bowl.
Shane, where do you sit on the Bills? I had them tucked in as my dark horse behind the Rams, who you mentioned yourself again. If I was put on the spot, they're not a team that a lot of teams would necessarily relish playing. But for every statement win, like they've had the 48-20 win over the Dolphins earlier this season, they put up some good wins and that 6-1 spell down the stretch. They've also had, they really struggled to get over the Patriots, who were obviously in a funk at the time, to put it mildly. And that game against the Dolphins, as Brian said, was it as much about the Dolphins coughing it up as it was about the Bills going to get it? They're still not necessarily a team that you're going to trust to get it done in the playoffs, but maybe that's exactly where they want to be. Maybe we're right back to where we started at the start of the season. I remember Brian saying it. Maybe the Bills are happy for us to sleep on them a little bit, rather than the last 2 seasons when they've gone in 13-4, 13-3 the previous year, looked like the class of the AFC, and it hasn't worked out.
Yeah, firstly, in relation to the Sunday night game, as much as the Bills managed to get things done on a defensive to make a few plays, that was the Dolphins' game to win, and they just didn't get it done. It was as simple as that. I would very much put the blame on the Dolphins losing that game rather than the Bills winning it. Fair enough, the Bills managed to get a fortunate touchdown. There was the punt return as well. But in terms of the way they've been playing all season, a lot of their wins, even at the tail end of the year, have been close. I mean, they beat the Dolphins by 7, the Patriots by 6, the Chargers by 2. They had a big win against the Cowboys, in fairness, but the Cowboys had an off day. And they managed to get a close one against the Chiefs, and they probably should have beaten the Eagles, but they didn't manage to get things done. There's a lot of very close games there, and that could mean one of two things. They're just not good enough to, when they're coming up against opponents, to really stamp dominance in a game. Or B, they're quite good at eking things in these close situations. And we talk a lot about situational football. It's the kind of thing that the Bills have gotten better at since the firing of Ken Dorsey, it must be said. And in terms of Josh Allen as well, I don't know whether it's because you mentioned earlier about some of the play calling, like that failed attempt to get out of bounds and to get the field goal near the end of the first half was a typical that we've seen from the Bills all season, that they have the plan, they have the talent, they just don't have the execution. What we have seen from Josh Allen, though, is particularly when he's running with the ball, he's a lot better player. There's a couple of times now where pressure came in from the Dolphins defenders, but he found his space, he found the run, he managed to do probably more impressive than he did beforehand. And even though he threw 2 interceptions, one of which was particularly sloppy, they were both in the first quarter, he managed to clean things up as the game went on. Whereas earlier in the season, Josh Allen was throwing things downfield that he'd absolutely no need to go for. So his decision making personally has been the one of the key differences in how the Bills have improved throughout the season. I don't know whether Ken Dorsey is the kind of person that maybe might have got into Josh Allen's head and tried to push him towards doing the more riskier things more often. And whether now that he's gone, it means that Allen is a bit more calm and a bit smarter about the way he's doing things, or whether it's just Josh himself maturing and realizing, okay, I can't keep throwing these stupid deep balls every time. I'm going to start a little bit smarter. And if I'm going deep for the Stephon Diggs, I'm going to make sure I'm doing it at the right time. And that is just, I think the Bills have learned from their experience early in the season and went on a good run. What I think is going to help them now in the playoffs is the fact that they have home field advantage for, the first 2 rounds at least, should they beat the Steelers, as I expect them to do this weekend. That is key. Are they going to go in and defeat a Kansas City or a Baltimore or something like that if they get as far as the AFC Championship game? It's difficult to know, but I think that the Bills are a team that every game they're going to play is going to be close. It's really down to execution as to whether they're going to be on the right side of a 3-point win or the wrong side.
Brian, in terms of other feel-good stories, if you like, heading into the playoffs, and the Packers we touched on a little bit earlier, have a guy quarterback, made it to the playoffs without Rodgers in year 1. They're young, they're hungry, they're dangerous. I know, tongue-in-cheek, I was slagging them earlier saying, well, they're just exactly where they expect to be. But in effect, as Shane pointed out earlier, they're really playing with house money here.
They are, yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I think the Packers have had such an unusual season. Like we joked and spoke about the differing of opinions over the course of the season. Like initially they were, all kind of hysterical about how well he started off with week 1 against the Bears, and then he kind of went through a bit of a struggle. Like we saw the defeat in Denver and a few other games, but he just didn't, he was struggling, but yet his numbers weren't reflective of that. He was still putting up good numbers. And then they kind of got it back together. They lose a Monday Night Football game to the Giants, which a lot of people felt they would win. And they got it back on track at the end of the season. I think what was evident last night, and you touched on today, Conor, when we spoke, was defensively. And okay, we can talk about maybe the flaws of the Bears' offense yesterday. Defensively yesterday, bearing in mind the pressure which this defense coordinator has been on over the course of the season, there's many a Packers fan who would like to see him relieved of his duties come the end of the season. They stepped up in a big way yesterday and got it done. It'd be interesting to see how they look to manage a Cowboys.
They've got a lot of the parts on that side of the ball, though, don't they? And we've talked about this before. Like Jair Alexander had a great game. The rookie Carl Brooks looks like a player. Rashan Gary's obviously one of the premier pass rushers in the league. There's some nice bits and pieces there, and they certainly all look to be coalescing quite well in that game.
Yeah, and they did this last year, the latter stage of last season, when they put themselves in a position to get into the playoffs. Obviously, they lost to the Lions come week 18. But a lot of that was down to the fact that the defense turned itself around. Early on in last season, they were struggling against the run. They were struggling against the run at times earlier on in the season. It hasn't come back together this season, maybe in the manner in which it did the latter stage of last season. But yesterday, when they really needed it, because once we talk about Jordan, I didn't think offensively yesterday they were at their best. So we've seen them play a lot better over the course of the last few weeks.
With the honourable exception of Aaron Jones, and this is one of those funny things where sometimes a guy gets injured early in the year, he comes back at just the right time. Aaron Jones looks fresh when everybody else is kind of dinged up. And they were talking about this in the game commentary yesterday, Shane. He actually looks faster than he ever has. And the Bears really struggled to contain him. This is the number 1 rushing defense in the league, the Chicago Bears, and they couldn't get a handle on him.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see that kind of talent, and it's the kind of thing that makes Green Bay dangerous. I mean, we talk a lot about the right players coming good at the right time. The question is, though, as to whether or not that speed will be enough to outdo whatever the Cowboys are going to score at home, which we know that they're particularly good in AT&T Stadium. And as much as we talk about the Packers being young, hungry, and maybe dangerous. I suppose they are dangerous and probably having a better season than they expected. This is senior hurling now. I don't know whether they'll be able to stick up in terms of strength, but it's great to see that they're finding ways to use their offensive talent and just make sure that defensively they're able to keep the other team down low enough.
The test coming on Sunday, Connor. Like, Cowboys are averaging 30 odd points a home game. Like we touched on today, realistically, they're going to have to put up at least 27 to 30 points to be in the position to win this game. And that's going to be down to Jordan Love. Can they replicate an offensive performance which we saw over the course of maybe the last 4 to 5 weeks?
We certainly we saw that the way that the 49ers handled the Cowboys to exploit their weak spots in the run game, the Packers might actually be set up to do that. I think that's probably their best chance to get a foothold in the game, and we shall see. Moving on to some of the other feel-good stories, though, Brian, the Texans, rookie quarterback, rookie head coach. We were talking about this on, week 0 and week 1 of the season as being an uphill battle, and we were hoping that D'Amico Ryans, widely liked, widely admired young coach heading into his first head coaching job, would at least get a chance to succeed. Boy, did himself and Stroud click and get it going.
Yeah, what a performance in many ways. I know they didn't necessarily keep the offense consistently going throughout the course of the game. Obviously, Colts at some stage kind of slowed them down, but it was more the way, having had their struggles, like, talk about taking the window of one team's sails. The Colts have a really good comprehensive drive in the opening part of the game, but yet they can't score a touchdown. And the first play on offense for CJ Stroud, and he shows a dinger to Nico Collins and it goes in for a touchdown. The one towards the end, though, in particular, where he was on his back foot, he's very clever and astute in what he's doing. He's thrown the ball away, but he's not throwing the ball away. He's putting in a position where, look, no one's going to intercept this, but if I can put the ball in a certain area, allow my player to go and potentially make a catch. And that's ultimately what he did. That Nico Collins catches, that's the marquee catch ultimately that got them to drive then, obviously, to go on and get that touchdown.
That's, as you touched on, that's an unbelievable play for both players. Like, it's very astute. Like, that's an IQ 200 play from Stroud, and that there's no danger if Collins can't come back and get it. But he makes a great play on the ball. Yeah, and we spoke about a couple of weeks ago where he had a little bit of a difficult spell for a couple of weeks, and we were asking why the head coach wasn't putting into his hands on 4th down, because he was being rushed and he was being harassed and he was being sacked. But in that instance, it looks similar to what we saw 4 or 5 weeks ago. I don't know whether he's learned the magnitude of what's gone on over the course of time in terms of recognizing the play and understanding, but there was something different about him on Saturday night. And, you're looking at a rookie quarterback against a backup quarterback, and it ultimately comes down to a play or two in the game, and you see what Gardner Minshew plays on the 4th down. That's why there's the difference. There's your quality quarterback you get out of a draft. There's your long-term future, as opposed to a quarterback that will win you games, but ultimately he's not your answer in the long term. Well, nice segue into Mason Rudolph there, Shane, a player who can win you games, but may not be your long-term answer. Not sure the Steelers particularly care right now, and we're not sure exactly how they got to the playoffs. I'm not sure if anybody can quite figure that out, but they did, and probably the least likely way possible. I mean, you would have thought that the best chance of them punching their ticket would have been that the Bills might lose to the Dolphins, which looked a 50-50 game. I don't think anybody thought that the Jags would go out and wet the bed, and that would be the way that it happened. But it did. And now that they're there, you think they're going to do any damage?
I'm not quite sure how much damage they'll be able to do. I think obviously the big difference in the last couple of games is the fact that they went from risky Trubisky and they moved on to Rudolph, who hasn't thrown an interception, whereas Mitch Trubisky threw an interception against the Patriots and 2 interceptions the week afterwards as well. Whereas the last 3 games they've won, they've had Mason Rudolph not attempting too many passes. I mean, he only attempted 20 passes against the Ravens on Saturday night. Najee Harris made 26 carries. That's been the thing. They're going typical AFC North style. We're going to batter this in, and eventually we'll get it over the line. And look, in fairness to them, they found a way to make it work. The defense as well, I think, has to stand up throughout the season, that they've managed to keep games winnable. Because a lot of these Steelers games have been tight. They've been physical. They haven't neither team in a lot of these games, whether it be the Steelers or whoever they're playing against, has managed to bring out a lot of these plays that light things up. These, long passes or runs that break for 30, 40, 50 yards. It's always been that tight thing. And the fact is the defense does its job and manages to keep, the opposition from producing their magic. it gives teams a chance, and that's how the Steelers have managed to play so long. And I think Mike Tomlin, as much as there's been a lot of question marks over his future, because the Steelers fans, as they are expected that a team shouldn't just be good enough to make the playoffs. It should be there. They should either be good enough to make the Super Bowl or they should be in rebuild mode. And the Steelers have been kind of this in between mode all season, where they've just been getting over the line. But in fairness to them, they've been getting over the line. And a win in the NFL is not easy. You should never take anything for granted. And I think how they're using Rudolph has been key to that, because they know not to force it. They've been designing plays that aren't special but will get the job done, and letting Najee Harris do most of the heavy lifting, which is, I think, it's grand for the last couple of games of the season. Maybe you're trying to push things over, especially against the Ravens team where they're playing a lot of backup players. Whether the Steelers can go far is difficult to see, because at some point, if Najee Harris is taking 26 carries and then another few on top of that when he's making receptions or blocks or whatever, that physically going to start wearing you down. He's been doing this for 3 weeks now, where he's been trying to carry that offense on his shoulders. That's going to start tearing him down. Plus, there's also the question marks over where the TJ Watt will be fit to the game. So, if they're playing against the Dolphins, or I can't remember what way they would have worked out had the Dolphins won last night, they might have had a decent chance. But the fact that
they would have gone to Kansas City, would they?
That's right. Yeah, they would have went to the 3 seed. They would have jumped to the 6 seed. Yeah.
Even Kansas City, they might have been able to go into Arrowhead and give it a chance against a team that's been kind of fighting amongst itself. If the defense managed to keep something tight and managed to frustrate the wide receivers. But I think the fact that they're going into Buffalo this week, Buffalo are still riding high. And if the Bills are going to lose momentum, I don't think it's going to come this weekend. And I think that's going to hurt the Steelers a little bit. The Steelers, will be tough. We'll play hard in the first half, but I think at some point that all that physical football is going to start taking its toll, and they're going to slow down the further they get into games.
All right, that brings us to the end of our second segment of Talking Points. Brian, we start our third segment of Talking Points from week 18, and we're still looking at the feel-good stories heading into the playoffs. You spoke about earlier how the Falcons had everything set up in front of them, and at one stage they seemed to have control of the NFC South, and then they slid at just the wrong time. The team that capitalized on that ultimately was the Buccaneers, and nobody more so than Baker Mayfield earned his $1 million playoff bonus, which looked pretty unlikely at the start of the season, but there they are.
Yeah, they've kind of started away in though, haven't they? Like it's kind of the reality of what we got next Monday night is a Bucs team that have kind of started their way into the playoffs at the end, and going against the Eagles team that have only won one of the last 6 games. But
how many get-rights games do the Eagles actually need to get right?
Well, maybe this is the one that will be the get-right
Giants, Cardinals.
It's going to be a reflection of where the odds are in this game, though. If you look at the QuinnBet app or the website, you see that the Eagles are only minus 2.5 point favorites. Like 6 or 7 weeks ago, you would imagine that would have been an 8.5, 9.5 type of game, but kind of a reflection of where both sides are. It's so many similarities really to last season, with the Bucs winning the division and the NFC East fifth seed being locked in by an NFC East team. They played on Monday night last year against the Cowboys. They're going to play the Eagles this week. Probably have a much better chance of beating the Eagles. Baker Mayfield yesterday was clearly playing with an injury. He obviously wanted to remain out there as long as possible to make sure, one, he gets the bonus, and two, ultimately he leads the team to a victory. But we touched on it a couple of weeks ago, and it's been very evident. And we did a piece with Andrew Morgan with the Thursday Night Football, and he's a big Bucs fan. The team have rallied around Baker Mayfield instantly since the day he went in there. And for a guy who had kind of a different opinion across the league of where his head's at, whether he's a kind of a team player, he's kind of, I don't know whether he's recognised this as last serious opportunity to be a starting quarterback in the league, but he's taken it on and he's gone in there. And to see a team that are really engrossed in terms of how he is during the games, if he goes down with a sack, the offensive line are over immediately getting them up. Like you recognise that type of thing. We've seen it in London, in particular with Josh Allen on the offensive line. The players are rallying around him. It's a good sign for the team. And Mike Evans has had a fantastic season. Colin rightly calls out, it's bizarre. He's no contract. He's going to be a free agent. He has had a quieter time of late. I just wonder, is next week that breakout game again for him to come back and kind of show what he was doing earlier on in the season. But look, it's a great storyline in the division. Yet again, that we wrote them off to start the season, Conor. We didn't think none of us thought they were going to win it. We thought there was a rebuild, but they've proven us all wrong.
We all had them in the 0-4 bracket when we were projecting forward, and we were all wrong. Very
much so, and I don't know whether it's in manner of the division. We saw the Saints yesterday. Like the Saints, No, we don't want to take away from the Bucks. They've won the division, but the Saints frustrate you because they go out yesterday and put 41 points.
Your
up
man
in
Derek
fast.
Carr was dealing. He was throwing dimes.
He's on fire, but this is Derek Carr. He does it when the pressure's off. Like ultimately, they knew yesterday they were never going to make the division. I think they were being strung along by the Bucks, for 3 quarters. It's just, it'd be interesting to see now next weekend. Like the Bucks need to make the step up to move on, win this game, or is it just going to be another case of another off season where we say, "Oh, that's the NFC South. It take care of itself. Whoever gets them beats them." If they were to turn them over next week, maybe the eyes will be raised, and they're a serious contender to go and potentially win a division around it.
All right, that's the feel-good teams, Shane. As we enter the playoffs, a couple of teams who are there and they're in the dance, so they're not going to feel too unhappy, but who ended the season on perhaps a bit of a sour note. And this might seem a strange choice for some people, but I'm putting the Detroit Lions in that category because, all right, they've won the division. They have a chance to win their first playoff game since 1991. Dan Campbell and his team have completely turned that thing around. However, you play your starters in week 18 at your peril. And they did have a chance to get the number 2 seed, a very unlikely outcome where they needed the Eagles and the Cowboys both to lose in the end. The Cowboys won and the Eagles lost. So the cost of playing your starters is Sam Laporta, your breakout tight end, one of the best rookie tight end seasons we've seen of all time, broke the receiving record for rookie tight ends, but unfortunately now is injured, as is Khalif Raymond, the dangerous punt returner and wide receiver who's been a bit of a breakout player for them this season. Slight echoes perhaps of the Chargers last year, who played their starters in week 18 with nothing to play for and ended up getting done in the playoffs by the Jaguars.
I think somewhat similar to the Chargers, and maybe I'm a denier or whatever. I think a lot of people are quite high on Dan Campbell. They love the fact that he goes for things. They love the fact that he's always about grit and it's all or nothing. And that's fair enough. That kind of builds into the Detroit culture. I mean, you have to remember this is a team that has only won their first divisional title in since the NFC Central in 1993. So they don't take things for granted. But I think, at times the decision making of Dan Campbell is what inspires them, but is also a liability. We saw that, I think, from my point of view, I think the decision to go for a 2-point conversion, especially when the second time around, when the first time they tried it didn't work out against the Cowboys, was a bad decision. You take your point, you try to get the overtime. I understand they were trying to get a win.
Again, it's kind of like Brian's point about Josh Allen. It depends on whether you've got that halo effect around you. Like one quarterback throws an interception like Josh Allen did against the Dolphins and he's a liability. Josh Allen does it. He's a gunslinger. Brandon Staley calls all these 4th and shorts and doesn't get them. What does he do? And he's gone mad. Dan Campbell does it. Come on, he's a gambler.
Yeah, there's a very fine line between being a genius and a gobshite, and I think that Dan Campbell has shown that in the last couple of weeks. And I think, again, playing your starters against Minnesota, and I understand it's a pride thing, and that's not I don't mean that as a pun because of the Lions.
Michael Irvin calls it mentality.
Yeah, but it's
mentality.
I understand that. Okay, they're playing against their rivals in Minnesota. They want to get a beat down, but come on, you're playing in the biggest game in. Probably the biggest game in the team's history. Certainly the biggest game the team has had in since before the 1990s. I mean, I saw there it's the most expensive wild card game in history to get a ticket for it. It's at minimum $600. The fans and everybody who have been dying for success are getting here, and you're putting all your starters out on week 18 for some meaningless win against the Vikings. May not be meaningless to them the same way that it's never a meaningless win for United to beat City or whatever. But still, there has to be a bit of foresight here. And Dan Campbell, again, is won a lot of hearts, especially after the Hard Knocks experience. I think the fact that he has led the team that he's played for into a new era is fantastic. And look, I think there's a lot of people rooting for the Lions here. And the Jared Goff story as well, the fact that some people see him as being effectively cast aside by Los Angeles, thrown out as, you're trash, you can go to Detroit and we can get Matt Stafford. And he's actually become a very good quarterback and is now coming against the Rams in Detroit house. There's a lot of comeback stories and there's a lot of blue collar underdog stuff that will make you want to root for the Lions. But I just think the decision making and the gung ho ness of it all can be a liability sometimes, and so it's one of those things where I nearly trust Detroit to keep a lead once they build it than I do to come back, because if they come back and like they were in Dallas, it's 19-20 and they have a point after attempt, he's gonna go for the 2, and then things are gonna mess up. And it's if the Vikings are a team that miss kicks, throughout their season and causes heartbreak. The Vikings, the Detroit Lions could double that and be the team that missed 2-point conversions. And if I was a Lions fan, I'd be afraid of that, and I'd certainly want to get a pretty good start against the Rams to beat them down and hope that it doesn't come to those close decisions later on.
Brian Shane alluded to it there. There's that great video going around of the NFL script writers, and they couldn't have written this one better. So you have Matthew Stafford going to play against Detroit, the team that he starred for so many years in the NFL, and Jared Goff playing against the team that dealt him away as the placeholder and the make weight in that deal. You have Tyreek Hill going to Kansas City to face his former team, the Chiefs, and you've got the Texans playing the Browns, of course, the infamous Deshaun Watson trade in the background of that one. So a lot of spicy storylines, but there's another one around this Detroit game as well.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point. Part of the thinking I would have thought from Dan Campbell was, did they want to get away from last week's play call at the end? That obviously would have had a bitter taste in their mouth. Did they want to, do you want that to be the last play which you have before you go into a playoff game? Was it a case of, let's get back out there, let's play some really productive offensive football and kind of put up points, put up scores, and then obviously get ourselves in the right frame of mind to go into this playoff game next weekend? I mean, you've talked about it there, Conor. There's so many storylines going into this weekend. As you said, the NFL couldn't have asked for better storylines between even the Joe Flacco is kind of taking a week off of being the storyline. I imagine that will come around again this weekend. But to have Jared Goff, we're all talking about Matthew Stafford going back in there now. Jared Goff is going to be looking at this as well, saying, Sean McVay gave up on me. I was the quarterback that got him
I
to
find
the
that
Super Bowl.
fascinating because we've referenced it a few times. And it's a great piece for anybody who hasn't read it. The ESPN piece, the long read, where the reporter was embedded with Sean McVay and his family after they won the Super Bowl, was very, very revealing, and kind of led a lot of people to nearly wonder for Sean McVay's health because of the intensity, the near insane intensity that he brought to the whole thing to help get them over the line. But Sean McVay talked about his profound guilt that he felt that he'd broken Jared Goff and he was too hard on him and he undermined his confidence. And I thought it's a very unusual thing for a head coach to own up to. I find that whole narrative fascinating because I think, as you say, a lot of the focus has been on, Stafford's going to go in there and this is the booby trap for the Rams. But Jesus, Jared Goff will have the bit between his teeth. He'll want to tear that thing to the ground. Yeah,
you look at the deal. I know we're 3 or 4 years removed from the Matthew Stafford deal. It was all towards the Lions. The Lions got all the picks. The Lions took on Goff's contract. It was like, we just need this guy gone at this stage. Matthew Stafford is the guy. And then when they won the Super Bowl, he came out with fresh comments saying, Sean McVay around, we needed a quarterback that we could rely on to bring us to the Super Bowl. It wasn't 2 years removed from Jared Goff being in the Super Bowl. So as much as everybody's going on, and I know there's a lot of Lions fans who are fearing the worst this weekend around the fact that Stafford will go in, and there's even conversations today
Lions
about what
fans
reception.
always fear the worst. That's their waking nightmare.
But I saw a poll on one of the local media things in Detroit today. Should we be recognizing what Matthew Stafford did for the franchise and give them a respectful return, or should we be building the effing out of him throughout the course of the game, which is the best one? And it was a split majority.
Go Philadelphia on him, rain down the booze until the game's over.
Galatasaray, they should be having the flares outside of the
welcome to hell.
The people are suggesting that this is a perfect game for the Rams. I think in many ways it's also a perfect game for the Lions. I mean, let's be fair. The Lions have put up an average 30-odd points a home game throughout the course of the season. A couple of weeks ago, they were written off for going against the Broncos, as people were saying the Lions have struggled. They hit a rebound that night and they put up 40-odd points. I mean, the Rams are going to have to live with them. And in fairness, the Rams have had great success offensively, but they're going to, this has a real ding-dong shootout feel about it. And, I think the Lions can live with them. And the Rams defense over the course of the last few weeks, teams have got at them. The Giants put up over 300 yards of offense last week in a struggling Giants offense. I know it's not like for like, game for game, but teams have put numbers up on them. The defense is rebounded well, but I still think they're there to be got it. I think the Lions have a real crack at this one on Sunday night.
The only thing I'm going to add to that very quickly is just the reason why I think that the Rams can do something is the fact that it's in Detroit. And I know that the Rams necessarily don't always have a fantastic home advantage, so playing away from home probably is a little bit easier to them than others. But I think that the Detroit crowd is actually something that could work to the Rams' favor if they manage to just put a bit of nerves into them. All it takes is for a shaky pass or for a turnover in the third quarter, heading into the fourth quarter, at the Rams will be like, you know what, we have these guys in the ropes, let's go for the kill. These Detroit fans are desperate for success because they've been so starved of it. So that the second that the rug starts being pulled, I think it has the capacity for things to go wrong very quickly. I could be wrong, but I think that if it's a close game coming in the end, I think the Rams have the edge. It's up to Detroit to, as you say, Brian, to say that this is our house, put the stamp on it. For Jared Goff to look at the Rams and decide, you know what, I'm going to get you from the start. If the Detroit don't win the game in the first half, I think they're going to lose in the second.
Brian, you mentioned teams that have been shaky enough defensively. The Dolphins, and we've harped on this quite a lot during the season. Beat a lot of sub 500 teams, padded their record a little bit, blew their shot at winning the division over the weekend. And we've talked about how it was really a lot more about them, the things that they didn't do, than the things that the Bills necessarily did in terms of not being able to stop the punt return, 2 bad interceptions by Tua. They have played 3 playoff teams in their schedule this year, and they've lost by an aggregate of 91 points over those 3 games. 1 bad beat against the Bills, and a really bad beat down by the Ravens. The suspicion remains that this is a relatively lightweight team. Now, if you want to allay that suspicion, the best thing to do is go to Arrowhead and turn the Chiefs over.
Yeah, they're 1-5, I believe, based on the teams that are in the playoffs, and they're 1-5 this season in terms of beating teams that have landed in the playoffs. That win ultimately was on Christmas Eve against the Cowboys when they only kicked 5 field goals. They didn't even score a touchdown in that particular game. Look, they've got a lot of injuries. Like, let's be fair, Tyreek Hill as well last night. He seemed to be getting up time and time again, and he was struggling. Waddle's out, offensive line struggles. Banged up on defense. You touched on it last weekend against the Ravens when they knew that game was completely gone. They should have been taking players out of that game, focusing on this week. They didn't. So again, we're talking about the Lions playing players unnecessary. That was the same last week. They're struggling without certain players in key positions. And I touched on it. Eli Apple plays, and he'll give you a few nice plays during the game, but ultimately he's not consistent enough to manage the likes of Diggs. And then
Eli Apple, who still doesn't know where Zay Flowers went from last week, and he comes up with a big interception, in fairness to him.
But over the course of the game, as the game went on, gradually Stephon Diggs got the grips on him. That's the problem with the likes of that player. They haven't got players that can ultimately come in and step in and keep the show on the road defensively. And when the offense was struggling for large parts of the season, defense stepped up. Like we saw that. We touched on the repeat of that game, which was the one in London, which is the Chiefs, and how well that defense played in the second half to allow that offense to come back. But you're right, like they still we're looking at this game in isolation about where the teams are right now. You would still give them a puncher's chance of going in there if they were to get back to some kind of form, which we saw earlier in the season. And the Chiefs play to the inconsistent nature of what we've seen over the last few weeks. But I thought last night was a big one. I know people are saying, oh, well, if they win, they'll play the Bills again. But it's a lot easier to play at home this week, play at home next week, and potentially play at home the following week. Like Shane has alluded to earlier with the Bills potentially playing now 2 home games in a row. I think it feels like it's a lost opportunity and a lost season for the Dolphins, which had so many positives, but people call them the fraud squad for a reason, and it's starting to kind of play out that way in many ways.
Before we wrap, I wanted to look at a couple of teams who fell outside the playoff bracket, unfortunately for them, teams for whom really it all went wrong. Top of the pile for me, Shane, is the Jags. I mean, 1 minute they're 8-3. We were talking about them in the conversation for the AFC 1 seed at that point. Since then, they've gone 1-6. They went from potentially clinching the division over the weekend to being out of the playoffs, losing to the Titans, who had nothing to play for. It wasn't supposed to end this way.
In fairness to the Titans, every game they've played, they've ran close, and they were never going to be an easy game. But still, the Jacksonville Jaguars should have had this division sewn up 3 weeks ago. Never mind leaving to the last day to try and go into Tennessee and get a result. It seems like Jacksonville is just not suited to prime time, because they went in, I believe it was the week of Thanksgiving, around that time, into Houston. What was billed and what a lot of people were very much looking forward to as a winner takes all for the AFC South. They go in, they win that game, their second win against the Texans that year. They were on a pretty good run after a decent start, plus 2 very good games in London. And then it all completely collapsed on, was it Sunday night or Monday Night Football, one or the other, when they played against the Bengals and Trevor Lawrence goes out injured. And once that one central cog was removed, or there was some question marks over it, everything just started falling apart. On defense, they didn't have the same level of confidence. Their version of Josh Allen still played well, but and that was never their strength anyway. And it kind of took a step back. Trevor Lawrence came back, and you could tell by just the amount of plays and the amount of time they were relying on him to make plays and to pass the ball and to run the ball as well, that they just that once he lost that 10%, the entire team just did not know where to pick up. If you're relying so much on the one player, you haven't got a running back, they give it to you. You haven't got a tight end or receiver that can you can give it short, that can make good yards after catch. It's very difficult to maintain momentum. That injury to Trevor Lawrence was bad, and they rushed him back from injury too quickly, I think. He didn't really get time to fully recalibrate himself after what many feared when he went off the pitch would be a season-ending injury. I was shocked when he came back the following week to play, and sure enough, they've suffered the consequences. They've lost 5 of the last 6. There's going to be a lot of questions about Doug Peterson and the organization in general, how they manage the end of the season, because it is not good enough. They have a team, and they're in a division which is very winnable. They have a team which they can get far into the playoffs, and they just completely made a mess of it near the end of the season. And I don't really know where the excuses lie on this, because it's just, we talk about the Eagles losing 5 of their last 6, and there's a lot of question marks there over their coordinators. But the Jags, like, that is, here's a chance to get a 2 seed, really. If they had kept the momentum, they probably would have finished with a better record than the Bills. They mightn't have got the 1 seed, but to completely collapse out of the playoffs, it's just frankly unacceptable.
Brian, the thing about the Jags last year was, they were the comeback kings. They were able to erase these double-digit deficits, but the question was how they kept getting themselves into that trouble in the first place. And that was something they were supposed to have addressed this year. The defense certainly took a big step forward, but the offense, unfortunately, and yes, the injuries to Trevor Lawrence certainly played a part in that, took a step back, and that cost them badly.
Yeah, but you touched on it early on in the season, Conor. There's only so many times you can be down by 10, 12 points, and you live on the sword, you die by the sword. You can't always find a way to materialize a comeback. They were 44% on 4th downs over the course of the season, but yet Doug Peterson continued to go for 4th downs. I know we're getting into the granular detail of games, but they were down by 2 scores yesterday. He went for it on 4th down as opposed to taking the field goal. If he had taken that field goal, bearing in mind they then had a follow-up drive with a touchdown, they would have been in a position where that Trevor Lawrence stretch would have been to take the lead. In fact, if they hadn't gone for that on 4th down and taken another field goal, then the final drive may have materialized to them only needing a field goal to win the game. Sometimes, as I keep saying, old school, take the points and see what comes of it. You can't continuously go for 4th downs. They did it a lot last season. They got away with it many times, and obviously this is what fans want to see. They want to see more attractive offense and going for it on 4th down. But sometimes you have to got to play the game, take the points, because ultimately yesterday, again, I felt it cost.
Brian's the one in Parnell Park screaming, take your point, take your point. Like players going for goal.
Yeah, well, look, some people have it more. Let's see how conservative certain head coaches are come this weekend in 3rd and 4th quarter when there's 3-point gimme field goals on offer. They'll gladly take the points. Look, over the course of the season, I was looking at who they beat over the course of the season. They won 2 games in London. It's fair to say the Falcons were very poor the first game with James that we'll call them. The following week, they got the Bills at the right side at the right time. People were obviously then, after that game, the big storyline was the fact that they were there for 2 weeks. They beat the Texans, fair enough, on the road. They beat the Saints. They beat teams who've struggled over the course of the season. When they came up against bigger and better sides, you touched on Trevor Lawrence coming back. He came back against the Browns on the road. That was a difficult game in itself. Like they struggled against better teams over the course of the season, but at the same time, they got ahead of themselves. We spoke, Conor. We talked about them being potentially in the running for 1 seed. I wonder where they're getting caught up. Were they smelling themselves, as we like to say? Because going into that Bengals game on the Monday night, no one gave the Bengals a prayer. The Bengals go and beat them in overtime.
Shane, the final team I have in the where did it all go wrong category, and this might be slightly unfair, is the Vikings. And it's more for where the season is finished up and the tricky off season ahead maybe than necessarily that they did anything wrong. Kirk Cousins goes down. Justin Jefferson is out for a crucial chunk of the season. They never recovered from that. They got that magic performance from Josh Dobbs, and that maybe gave us a little bit of a false dawn as far as the Vikings were concerned. But for a team that went 13-4 last year and surged into the playoffs in an unlikely way, having won all those close games despite having a negative point differential. We had talked about it here on the show at the start of the season, how the Vikings might play as well as they did last year but finish with a worse record. In many respects, that's kind of what happened. They certainly stepped forward on defense, which was their big defect last year, but unfortunately they finished the season on a real low. beaten in that game by the Lions, really, carpeted by the Packers the previous week, and question marks now over what happens at the quarterback position and whether they're in full rebuild mode now from here.
Yeah, I mean, here's a team that was walking on a tightrope going into the season anyway. I mean, it's somewhat in parallel to the Steelers now, only I guess with more positive media coverage and talk around the Vikings last year than the Steelers have now. But as soon as we got into the start of the season and the Vikings start coming up against opponents where they started losing these close games or they started losing quite bad, you knew it was going to be a much tougher season. And look, I thought they had the talent to keep up appearances, but I mean, they went in at the start and they lost their first 3 games by 3 points to the Bucs, by I think it was 12 points or a little bit less than that to the Eagles, and then in a close game to the Chargers of all teams. I mean, once they had that 0-3 beginning, we knew it was going to be quite tough, and that was before the quarterback situation after quarterback situation kept hitting the team. It's the Vikings have been a very interesting watch. I don't know how the fans have necessarily felt, because it's just the second that you thought that the season was going to get back on track, another strong wind came off the Great Lakes and pushed them back off that tightrope again. And it was just, and I don't think they're a team that has much to worry about in the long term. They just need to find a way to settle their quarterback situation. I don't know whether trying to make a move in the draft or whether there is another player who could fit in, because I'm not quite sure if Kirk Cousins is going to stick around. Nick Mullins and the Pastronaut or anybody else who they've had there obviously is not a long-term situation. That is going to be the big question mark, because in anything else, I think their defensive philosophy is different. Everyone's saying how they love to blitz. Colin loves saying how they love to blitz, they love to put the pressure on, and that's fine. That's a way to play, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. They're in a division which is tough. In fairness to them, they've had a tough run of games, but as soon as they got to that 0-3 start, it was very difficult for them to sort of get any grip onto the season. And I think it's we're talking a lot about here at the end of the season about how what teams need to do to make to the playoffs, but when you only have 17 games in a season, there isn't a part of the year that is more important than the other. This is the Vikings are a good case study into why the winning your early games is important, because the Eagles won their early games and they still managed to make the playoffs. The Vikings didn't, and that's where they managed to take their step back.
Brian, it would be sad from a Vikings perspective and from a Cousins perspective if the last Kirk Cousins highlight is him with a stop off and the chains out before the Packers game. Unfortunately, that did not prove to be the harbinger of good times ahead for the Vikings in that game, because they got a beat down, as we were discussing. But I mean, if he goes, there's definitely a market for him, you would think, particularly the way he was playing this season.
He obviously had a little bit of a difficult start to the season, but he got it back on track. Yeah, there's going to be many a team out there that need a proper, solid quarterback, and you could argue he's top 10 type of quarterback, but ultimately it's going to come down to what kind of contract. If I say, for example, he had played the season, Connor, and they had just missed out in the playoffs, but he had a really productive season. Where does he sit in terms of the contract that's an offer? The fact that he's had this injury, is the power gone? In terms of him negotiating the contract, or is the team going to say, we trust in the medics and the medical staff that you've got over this serious injury, because it is a serious injury, and he comes back and he plays at the same level. I mean, the difficulty, he comes back next year and he doesn't play at the same level in which he did this year or previous year when they made the playoffs, and they're strapped into a 2 or 3 year contract. I think everybody's going to be looking at the Broncos situation and what's happened over the course of the last 2 years with Russell Wilson, and a little bit kind of hesitant to throw out these contracts. They're picking 11th in the draft. I think ultimately they'll probably try take the back end or whatever quarterback, whether it's a Penix or Bo Nix or something like that, and move on from Cousins. But Cousins will certainly get his opportunity. It's where he ends up. I wonder is Denver the type of place, or even New England type of place in which he could end up next season?
Back to Washington once more.
Potentially, yeah, it's another one.
Like that. I'm sure he'd like that.
Yeah, it's a different dynamic now. He's so many years removed from the Washington. From to go back there, it wouldn't feel the same.
No Dan Snyder, new ownership group. Depends who they bring in as head coach. Kirk Cousins, obviously, as anybody who watched quarterback knows, is literally the nicest man in the world. If you want a culture change in an organization, Kirk is the man you bring in and be the equivalent of an exorcism in that place.
Well, I don't know just in terms of Kirk Cousins, whether he'd be the kind of guy to bring into somewhere that has a young quarterback, but they don't want to start him yet. The same way that Aaron Rodgers kind of brought up Jordan Love for a little bit, that they might try to
Did Jordan Love thrive because of Aaron Rodgers or in spite of Aaron Rodgers? I'm still wondering about that one.
Well, I'm not going to get into that, but take that as a kind of model, as in, let's say, hypothetically here, Carolina want to bring him in to try and help Bryce Young settle, or if Washington want to draft somewhere a little bit lower, they bring in a young quarterback, but to have Kirk Cousins to do a job for a year or two and let somebody progress. I don't know if Kirk Cousins might be the type of person who'd be suited to that, but at the same time, who in the league, there's only so many quarterbacks going around. There aren't 32 franchise quarterbacks. Who in the league is gonna make that decision? It's an interesting one. I'm not quite sure. I'm really not quite sure what his future looks like.
Well, I'm telling you, apart from our shredded upper bods and our penchant for rocking the gold drip, the other thing that all three of us have in common with Kirk Cousins is we will be watching the playoffs from our couches over the following couple of weeks. And boy, do we like that, because we're really looking forward to it. We'll have plenty more content for you as the playoffs unfold. We might even grow our playoff beards while we're at it.